Hello there. Welcome to a few moments of our quarantine existence to talk about an interesting story from American history. Today, apropos of our current situation, I'd like to discuss a little story about Benjamin Franklin. Everyone knows about Ben Franklin, the supposed discoverer of electricity, the inventor of the bifocals, one of the founding fathers, the $100 bill, not a president. Here's a story about the origin of American journalism, the origin of American pandemic response, and a forgotten piece of history from Benjamin Franklin's own life. We have to begin in 1704, which is the origination of all American newspapers, the Boston Newsletter, started by printer John Campbell in 1704. All newspapers had to be licensed by the Crown, which meant that the British Empire had to sign off on every newspaper printed in the colonies. From 1704 to 1719, the Boston Newsletter was the number one source of news and information in all of the northeastern American colonies. By 1719, however, the Boston Gazette had been founded, which was being run by a group of local grandees, merchants, the 1%. Among the staff members at the Boston Gazette was a young man named James Franklin, who in his early 20s had struck out on his own as a printer. In 1721, which is the beginning of our story, a British warship known as the Seahorse, fresh from a pirate hunting exhibition in Barbados, had anchored in Massachusetts Bay Harbor. Unbeknownst to the citizens of Boston, that ship carried with it smallpox from the Caribbean. The British Navy allowed its sailors certain shore leave allowances, and they broke their quarantine, escaping from the ship anchored 2 miles off and later infecting the town. Within a few days, cases of smallpox erupted across Boston. The death toll in later days was reckoned to be about 14% of all those who were infected. Having 14% of the city ill and dying obviously created a political controversy. The city of Boston was being run by a group of merchants, colonial officials, and what we call the country party, which were the sort of rural squires, the men who had snapped up huge chunks of land in the early years of the colony, and who lived in a sort of rural, isolated, yet almost medieval kind of power structure. Slaves, servants, indigenous peoples, all congregated in these rural landholdings. Those people were opposed to any sort of centralized authority coming out of Boston, insofar as it affected their business dealings. They were fine with the merchants, they were fine with receiving supplies, but they did not want the government in Boston telling them how to do anything. So as the smallpox outbreak grew in strength, businesses were being shuttered, people were dying in the streets. It was mass panic. The central authority in Boston attempted to institute a kind of quarantine, a kind of pandemic response. Among those responses was the supposed new science of inoculation. Now, inoculation, which differs from vaccination in that to inoculate someone is to infect an otherwise healthy person with a live culture of a virus. In 1721, that meant finding someone who had smallpox, cutting open one of their pustules, running a string through the wound, and then introducing that infected string to a cut on an otherwise healthy person. That would then give them a live culture of smallpox. They would become ill with the sickness and hopefully survive. Vaccination, on the other hand, is when a person is infected with a more or less benign version of a disease, such as the cowpox vaccination, which later replaced the inoculation process for smallpox in the 1700s. That was years in the future. In 1721, Cotton Mather, the famous minister of Massachusetts Bay who presided over the Salem witch trials, in his later years had become more science-focused. He was less interested in dunking witches, burning witches, denouncing witches, less interested in that and more so in actually discovering scientific methods to prove various diseases. He had become a proponent of inoculation. That is the infestation of a healthy person with a live culture of a disease. He proposed this, and the immediate reaction in Boston and surrounding colony was that he was a crank, and perhaps rightly so. Considering his history as the man who presided over the Salem witch trials, people were less than willing to listen to his scientific advice. That said, there were a few doctors, many of whom had had contact with the indigenous peoples, who were more open to alternative means of medication. The chief doctor, in this case, was Zebediah Boylston, a Boston town doctor who was more than happy to experiment with this inoculation theory of disease. Now, it was called a theory, and it was looked down upon in large part because most of the Massachusetts Bay Colony grandees didn't trust it, in that it came from places like Turkey and in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the Turks from Constantinople and throughout all of Africa, really, but especially sub-Saharan Africa, from which many of the slaves were being drawn into the American colonies, had been practicing inoculation for hundreds of years. But owing to its origins in a non-European climate, it was looked down upon. It was mistrusted as witch doctor medicine, something that only slaves would risk their lives to undergo. That said, Cotton Mather experimented on his own slave, and the results were that he had no sickness. So the inoculation method became a political hot-button topic. In one sense, because it was seen as a sort of unclean way of treating a disease. It went against prevailing Puritan Christian ideas of how disease should be cured, that is, that God would cure you if you were good enough to be cured. And it represented an effort by the Boston colonial authorities to exert a public health measure across the entirety of the colony, thus angering the elite, remote rural country party landowners. Into this climate of uncertainty and anger and fear, James Franklin left the Boston Gazette, struck out on his own, and started the New England Courant. 1721, the very year of the outbreak stemming from the seahorse, set up his own printing shop against the advice of his own friends and benefactors, and enlisted the help of his young brother, Benjamin Franklin. The New England Courant differed dramatically from prior colonial newspapers in that it took a satirical approach to covering what was called the news. It was akin to The Daily Show. It incorporated satire, poetry, it had pseudonyms. One of those pseudonyms being Benjamin Franklin's own, Silence Dogood. At the age of 14 or 15, it's unclear exactly how old he was when Benjamin Franklin began working for the Courant. But this is when he unveiled the first of his many pseudonymous columns. And the sole point of the New England Courant was to provide a sort of educational / entertainment uplift to the colony amid the lockdown of the smallpox quarantine. But it very quickly morphed into a anti-inoculation pamphleteering operation. Anyone who was suspicious of Cotton Mather, who didn't like the British colonial authority coming from Boston, who had bad business dealings with the rich merchants in Boston, could take the smallpox inoculation issue and use it as a millstone on which to grind their axe. James Franklin leaned into this as hard as he possibly could and found immediate success with the New England Courant, in part because of the inventive prose of his little brother. They spent the next 2 years in a concerted effort to discredit anyone and everyone who was pro-inoculation. This spurred the first ever American newspaper war. For months, and the better part of a year and a half, the Boston Gazette and the New England Courant were filled with nothing but attacks on one another, some anonymous, some others under the actual author's name, trying to discredit and disinform partisans on both sides of the issue. This occurred until about 1723, when a change in policy at the British court favored inoculation. King George had his daughters inoculated, and some of the first tests were coming back. What they discovered was that while 14% of all those who contracted smallpox and were not treated with inoculation, which is what they called contracting smallpox by the natural way, 14% of all those died. However, the trials from Cotton Mather's experiments and Dr. Boylston's experiments showed that only 2.5% of those who'd been inoculated died. On the strength of all these bits of evidence, and with approval from the Crown, public weight in the debate sort of shifted toward the pro-inoculation side. And that's when James Franklin started to see his success at the New England Courant dry up. It's also when Benjamin Franklin started to have a difference of opinion with his brother and took issue with the fact that he was preying on public fears to promote his own business. This is around the time when Benjamin Franklin decided to separate from his brother and move to Philadelphia to begin his own, as we know, celebrated printing career. James Franklin sort of fell by the wayside. The issue began to sort of blow over, by the 1730s as the infection ran its course. All those who had died were going to die, and those who were saved by the inoculation were clearly very grateful to people like Cotton Mather and Dr. Boylston. The postscript to this story is that Benjamin Franklin, though he started his printing career as an assistant to his brother, peddling an anti-inoculation campaign, completely altered his opinion by 1736, when, as an older man with a 4-year-old son, his son died of smallpox, contracted it and died at the age of 4 because he had not been inoculated. At which point Benjamin Franklin publicly disavowed his prior positions and issued a heartfelt and bitter denunciation of himself for not having believed the medical science of the day. He carried that pro-inoculation viewpoint with him into the 1770s, when General George Washington, during the Revolutionary War, asked Benjamin Franklin what he should do when faced with a smallpox outbreak in the Continental Army. Drawing on his prior experience, Benjamin Franklin said, "You need to inoculate those people." Although, by that time, the vaccination theory had taken hold. So, rather than being inoculated with live cultures, the American colonial soldiers were vaccinated using the methods that we would recognize today. The cowpox vaccination was the one that was used. Historians say that in 1777, when George Washington vaccinated the Continental Army, was the pivotal moment of his entire generalship. That if he had not done so in 1776 or 1777, the army would have been so sickened that it would have been defeated by the British Imperial Army within probably a year. So, the story of America's first pandemic looks very similar to the one we experience today, which is when political fault lines are exacerbated, medical information and disinformation become the difference between life and death, and people of good faith may disagree. However, when given solid scientific evidence, the smartest ones will change their opinions.